Hello, this is Claudia, and for the next hour I'll be reading from the March 18th issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Dozens killed, possibly many more, in Pakistani airstrike on Kabul. A Pakistani airstrike on a drug rehabilitation center killed dozens of people in Kabul, Afghanistan's capital, on Monday night in the deadliest single attack of an escalating conflict between the two neighbors. There were at least 75 bodies in body bags or coffins in the backs of ambulances that shuttled back and forth throughout the night and on Tuesday morning. An initial assessment by a United Nations agency at the site said that the death toll could be much higher, noting that its observers found the complete destruction of one part of the facility, which housed about 180 adolescents, with no survivors reported. Pakistan claimed responsibility for the strike, one of 6 that it carried out on Afghanistan on Monday. But in a post on X, Pakistan's information minister Atullah Tarar said the target had been an ammunition depot. Monday's strike was the third time Pakistan hit the Afghan capital in recent weeks. A Taliban spokesman warned on Tuesday that Afghanistan would retaliate, a step that could lead to all-out war between two countries whose populations share deep cultural bonds. Pakistan, which once supported the Taliban, accuses Afghanistan's Taliban government of harboring an Islamist terrorist group responsible for hundreds of attacks in Pakistan in recent years. Armed groups operate on both sides of their 1,640-mile border. Officials from the two countries met regularly until last October, when the two militaries clashed along that border. In late February, Pakistan declared open war against the Taliban government in Afghanistan. Since then, Pakistan has launched dozens of airstrikes on Afghanistan's 2 largest cities and in border areas. Though Pakistan's ultimate objective remains unclear, it has pummeled Afghan military infrastructure with strikes that have also hit or damaged civilian homes, refugee camps, and health facilities, according to the United Nations. The United States has said that Pakistan has a right to defend itself, a stance that Pakistani officials have said privately that they interpret as a green light to conduct their operations. Pakistan has ignored calls for dialogue from China, its primary partner, despite public mediation efforts over the past week. Both sides urgently need to step back and return to the negotiation table, said Ibrahim Bahis, a senior Afghanistan analyst at the International Crisis Group based in Kabul. Without a ceasefire, the situation risks escalating further, with civilians likely to bear the brunt. The compound hit by the Pakistani airstrike on Monday housed a drug rehabilitation facility run by the Taliban government. A spokesman for the Afghan Ministry of Health said 200 patients were staying in the building that had been struck. A billboard atop an adjacent charred building read Support and Treatment Center Omid, or Hope in the Dari dialect. On Tuesday, hundreds of people pressed against the compound's entrance, many inquiring about relatives. Basmina Kudadi asked for news about her brother, who had been admitted about 6 weeks ago, she said. She had brought him fresh clothes last month, she said. We have not informed his wife yet, Miss Kudadi said. The numbers are in the hundreds, Jacob Karidi, the head of the Afghanistan office for the Norwegian Refugee Council, said about the casualties after visiting the site. He said he had seen no military facilities in the immediate area. In a statement on Tuesday, Pakistan's Minister of Information, Atullah Tarar, said all targeting has been done with precision only at those infrastructures which are being used by Afghan Taliban regime. Monday's death toll was the worst since late February, when Pakistan launched strikes on more than 20 locations, killing at least 274 people, according to the Pakistani military. Afghan troops attacked more than 50 Pakistani border positions during that fighting, and Afghanistan said it killed 55 Pakistani soldiers. The UN mission in Afghanistan estimates that 115,000 people have been displaced there. Some facilities built during the U.S. war in Afghanistan have been repurposed by the Taliban authorities, including former military bases now housing religious schools. The Omid Drug Rehabilitation Center was set in a former U.S. base not far from Kabul's international airport. By Tuesday, dozens of blood-stained mattresses laid scattered among the debris as firefighters and emergency teams carried bodies into ambulances under the close watch of hundreds of armed personnel. The destroyed building, Afghan officials said, was a 180-foot long structure used for meals and prayer. In smaller adjacent buildings, the debris contained white and blue patient gowns, identical sandals, and bottles of medicinal syrup. Other buildings adjacent to the large structure, each containing 20 to 30 bunk beds, also caught fire. Afghanistan has long been the world's leading source of illegally produced opium, but a ban by the authorities led to a sharp decline in opium production in 2023. Still, the use of cannabis and synthetic drugs like methamphetamine remains a major public health concern. As flames were still raging in the early hours of Tuesday, Muhammad Hidari, aged 23, stood dumbfounded. He said his two uncles had been admitted to the center in February. "I don't know if they are alive or dead," Mr. Hidari said. "Each one has children and family waiting for them to return home." Why this jump in gas prices feels different. A state-by-state look at the increase and how it could affect you. Since the start of the war in Iran, the average price of gas in the United States has climbed by nearly $1. In mid-February, gas cost around $2.90 per gallon. By mid-March, it was up to $3.70, according to the Energy Information Administration. It's the second largest four-week increase in at least 30 years, bigger than the one at the start of the war in Ukraine in 2022, or the ones associated with the post-recession surge of 2009 and the OPEC production cuts in 1999. The only bigger jump came after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, when gas supply fell significantly. Largest four-week changes in gas prices since 1990. September 5th of 2005, plus 30%. March 16th of 2026, plus 27%. March 14th of 2022, plus 24%. June 1st of 2009, plus 21%. And April 5th of 1999, plus 21%. The typical U.S. driver travels around 1,000 miles each month. Depending on the car, those higher prices translate to as much as $50 more a month. Cost to drive 1,000 miles in a hybrid at 52 miles per gallon, before $56, after $72. That's a change of plus $16. The average car, 25 miles per gallon, $117 before, $149 after, change plus $32. Truck, getting 17 miles per gallon, before $172, after $219. That's a change of plus $47. No state has been spared. Average prices are up by more than 50 cents per gallon everywhere, and by more than $1 in New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado, according to the AAA Motor Club. Price of gallon of gas in New Mexico before $2.61, after $3.79, the change $1.18. Arizona before $3.16, after $4.33, the change $1.17. Colorado before $2.76, after $3.82, that's a change of $1.06. Nevada, $3.64 before, after $4.59, that's a plus change of 95 cents. California, $4.59, after $5.53, that's a change of 94 cents. Crude oil price drives gas prices, and oil has spiked since the start of the war because of supply disruptions. Major oil exporting countries in the Persian Gulf can't get their product through the Strait of Hormuz, a critical and narrow waterway along Iran's southern coast. Prices have continued to rise despite the release of strategic oil reserves. The increases are having the biggest effect on lower-income households, who spend a larger share of their earnings on gasoline than higher-income Americans. But if you look at the history of gas prices, this month's spike appears a little smaller. Consider the last 50 years. Gas prices are still lower than they were at the start of the Ukraine war. And when you adjust for inflation, they're still below prices in the late 2000s and early 2010s. Americans are more insulated from oil shocks today than decades ago. Petroleum makes up a tiny share of electricity generation, less than 1%, down from 11% in 1980. Oil prices hit consumers on the road most of all, but even there, less so. The country's cars are more efficient, on average, and a growing share of Americans are driving electric vehicles. Still, there are plenty of old and less efficient cars on the road, and those owners will face these prices at the pump over and over, prices that might go higher still. As Iran war drags on, Europe wants to avoid a new migration crisis. A decade ago, a surge in migration to Europe spurred the far right's rise. European leaders now fear that Iran war could set off another crisis, and they have taken tentative steps to prepare. The longer the war in Iran continues, the more European officials worry it will spur a new refugee crisis. That fear is driving anxious scenario planning and back-channel diplomacy over how to prevent a fresh wave of migration from roiling Europe. The planning includes consultations between officials from the European Union and Turkey, the geographic buffer between Iran and Europe that was a thoroughfare a decade ago for more than 1 million migrants who made their way to the continent by sea. The talks intensified with a phone call 2 days after the war started. In the call, Hakan Fidan, the Turkish foreign minister, assured Magnus Brunner, the European Union's migration commissioner, that Turkey was working to avoid a repeat. Officials had hardened the Turkish border with Iran, Mr. Fidan said, and would work with Europe to block any new wave of refugees, according to Mr. Brunner's account of the call in a subsequent broadcast interview. Mr. Brunner and Mr. Fidan then agreed that if the U.S.-Israeli assault maintained a narrow focus, the fallout might be contained, according to European and Turkish officials briefed on the call. If the strikes broadened and Iran became unstable, Mr. Brunner and Mr. Fidan concluded that people could try to flee, according to the people briefed in the discussion, who also confirmed Mr. Brunner's account. They spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive diplomacy. Anxiety over a possible new migration crisis joins a growing list of global consequences from the war in Iran. Across the world, leaders and citizens alike are dealing with rising fuel costs, warnings of a recession, and snarls in trade flows. In Europe, that fallout has been compounded by fears of a renewed populist backlash to a new wave of refugees, the type that has boosted far-right anti-immigrant parties over the last decade. The conversation between Mr. Brunner and Mr. Fidan on March 2nd was a preliminary discussion and did not lead to concrete new steps to prepare for a potential migration surge, European diplomats and Turkish officials said. That is largely because more than 2 weeks into the war, there have been no signs of Iranians or Afghans living in Iran amassing at the Iran-Turkey border seeking to flee. Mass movements of refugees can take years to peak. After civil war broke out in Syria in 2011, it took nearly 4 years before Syrian migration to Europe reached crisis levels. But as the war persists, more European officials have worried about that scenario. The concerns intensified after fighting flared between Israel and Hezbollah, the Iran-backed Lebanese militia setting off mass displacement from southern Lebanon. We do not want to see a scenario like Syria, Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor of Germany, told an audience in Munich. A week after the war began, he added, "We have a strong interest ourselves in avoiding new influxes of refugees from the region." Mr. Merz raised similar concerns after meeting last week with the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic. Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the executive branch of the European Union on Sunday, sent a letter focused on migration to leaders of the bloc's 27 member states. The conflict has already led to the internal displacement of millions of people, notably in Iran and Lebanon, Ms. von der Leyen wrote, adding that while people were not crossing into the European Union yet, what the future holds remains unclear. She said leaders should use every migration diplomacy tool we have at our disposal. European officials are scarred by the political backlash to the surge of refugees that poured into Europe from countries like Syria and Afghanistan, peaking between 2014 and 2016. Europe has since hardened its borders and persuaded transit countries like Turkey to act as the continent's border guards, but its actions came too late to prevent the rise of far-right anti-immigration parties in countries like Germany, Austria, and France. The far-right Alternative for Germany, or AfD, is now polling neck and neck with Mr. Merz's party despite the introduction of measures like German border checks to stop some migrants before they can enter the country. The flow of new migrant arrivals to both Germany and Europe sharply fell in 2017 and has ebbed further since. The European Union's border agency Frontex reported that unauthorized border crossings dropped by a quarter in 2025, continuing a years-long trend. During the crisis a decade ago, Europeans accused Turkey of turning a blind eye to people smuggling between Turkey and Greece. Smugglers operated with ease along the Turkish coast until European leaders agreed to send billions of dollars in aid to the Turkish government. Now European leaders appear keen to forestall that kind of outcome. The call between Mr. Fidan and Mr. Brunner grew out of a weekend of intense coordination between Ms. von der Leyen and Middle Eastern leaders. Turkish and European officials briefed on the diplomacy said that all sides shared a wariness about a new migration wave, even if there were no significant planning yet for any kind of coordinated response. Turkey's Interior Minister Mustafa Siftisi told reporters in early March that his government had prepared 3 contingency plans to deal with potential migration flows caused by the war. These included setting up buffer zones at the border to house refugees and, in the case of very large numbers, allowing the refugees to cross the border and seek shelter inside Turkey, Mr. Siftisi said. He called the last option a last resort, adding that Turkey could initially host up to 90,000 people in tent camps and other temporary accommodations. Because of the proximity to long-running conflicts in the Middle East and Asia, Turkey hosts one of the largest refugee populations in the world. The civil war in Syria that began in 2011 led to large numbers of refugees crossing its long border with Syria, overwhelming host communities. The number of registered Syrian refugees in Turkey has fallen to 2.3 million from its peak of 3.7 million in 2022, according to the UN refugee agency UNHCR. The presence of so many refugees is a sensitive political issue for the government, which has stepped up measures along its borders to prevent refugees from entering. Prolonged war in Iran could unsettle the country's more than 760,000 refugees who are mostly from Afghanistan, according to data collected by UNHCR. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Trump promised the world's lowest drug prices. We checked the numbers. The Trump RX website claims to offer the best prices for medications. Here's where Americans still pay more and much, much more. President Trump and top federal health officials have repeatedly claimed that their new website, Trump RX, offers Americans the world's lowest prices on prescription drugs. I took prescription drugs, a very big part of health care, from the highest price in the entire world to the lowest, Mr. Trump said during his State of the Union address last month. That is not true. According to a review by the New York Times and the German news organizations Süddeutsche Zeitung, NDR, and WDR, the drugs listed on Trump RX can cost American patients up to hundreds or thousands of dollars, while a patient walking into a German pharmacy pays next to nothing. The German health system foots the bill, and records show that more often than not it pays less than what the Trump administration negotiated for Americans. The Trump RX website shows the prices that the administration negotiated for a few dozen of the several thousand prescription medications in the United States. The list includes almost none of the most widely used drugs like statins or ultra-expensive drugs like cancer therapies. Some well-known drugs on the list are Exjance for autoimmune conditions and Fargia for diabetes and heart and kidney problems. Both are cheaper in Germany, a rare example of a country that makes its negotiated drug prices public. The biggest names on Trump Rx are two blockbuster weight loss drugs, Wegovy and Zepbound. Both are available for lower out-of-pocket prices at pharmacies in wealthy countries around the world. In some cases, Americans pay about twice as much as patients overseas. Higher price for Wegovy on Trump Rx. How much patients pay out of pocket at a pharmacy without using insurance for a 4-week supply of a medium dose 1 milligram of Wegovy? Novo Nordisk's injection for weight loss. Japan, $163. France, $196. Denmark, $198. Germany, $198. Britain, $222. Switzerland, $225. Italy, $282. Trump Rx, $349. Canada, $375. Some countries, like Germany, mandate the same prices as every pharmacy, and in the other countries, some pharmacies may charge more or less than the price in the chart. Source: prices at local pharmacies. The review by the Times and its German partners is an assessment of one of Mr. Trump's signature domestic issues. With gas prices rising because of the unpopular war in Iran, the president is counting on his drug policy to resonate with voters who are concerned about affordability. Mr. Trump has repeatedly claimed that this policy alone should be enough to carry Republicans to victory in November's midterm elections. Our analysis shows that with some drugs, Mr. Trump appears to have modestly narrowed the gap between European and U.S. prices, but the gap persists and the reality does not match his hyperbole. This is particularly true for patent-protected drugs, which consistently were cheaper in Germany. White House officials and pharmaceutical companies contested our findings. They argued that the gap disappears after adjusting for the economic conditions in every country. That means that Trump Rx prices can count as cheaper, even when the price is higher. The administration did not provide enough detail about how it ran those numbers for that claim to be checked. We examined raw numbers comparing prices in U.S. dollars. By any objective measure, no president has accomplished what President Trump has in the past year alone to lower prescription drug prices for American patients, couche de say, a White House spokesman said. Mr. Trump has long complained that Americans pay too much for medicines, while Europeans pay too little. The president diagnosed a real disparity. Brand-name drugs in the United States have been shown to be 3 times as expensive on average as those in other wealthy nations. The varying prices reflect negotiations between drug makers and governments. Drug makers charge more when they have stronger leverage. Some countries, like those in Europe, are more willing to deny their citizens a drug if the price is too high. In recent months, the Trump administration struck price deals with 16 major drug makers. The Trump Rx website is most likely to benefit patients who do not have insurance coverage for their drug or have insurance plans that will subject them to high out-of-pocket costs. To test Mr. Trump's claims, the Times and its partners conducted 2 analyses. First, we compared Trump Rx prices with those paid by the National Health Insurance System in Germany. That gave us a uniquely direct comparison in an industry where prices are often kept secret. Second, we visited pharmacies in 8 cities around the world to compare prices for Wegovy and Zepbound. Because patients typically pay out of pocket without insurance for these weight loss drugs, this gave us another apples-to-apples comparison. Here's what we found. German prices beat those on Trump Rx more often than not. German patients typically pay a small fee capped at €10 or about $11.50 for prescription drugs. That's because, like most wealthy countries, Germany covers most drugs through its public health system. From the Research Institute of the major insurance provider AOK, we obtained the prices that the health system pays for each drug. We were able to directly compare 24 of the 43 drugs initially listed on Trump Rx. Germany's prices were lower in more than half the cases, at least. The difference was most pronounced when it came to the 6 patent-protected drugs on the list. The German price was consistently cheaper, sometimes by a lot. American parents using Trump RX, for example, would pay $2,700 more each month for Ngenla, a hormone treatment for children with stunted growth. Cheaper drugs in Germany. Here, prices for a few patent-protected drugs compare between Trump RX and Germany. Avidrel syringe, infertility, $10 cheaper in Germany. Vargi high dose, 30 pills, diabetes, heart and kidney problems, $88 cheaper. Xduo XR 5 milligrams, 60 pills, diabetes, 116 cheaper. Ozempic 1 milligram injection pen, diabetes, $122 cheaper. Gelance liquid autoimmune conditions, $1,653 cheaper. Nagenia high-dose 2 injection pens, stunted growth in children, $2,723 cheaper. Generic drugs seem to fare better under Trump RX. 10 of the 18 drugs on the list that have lost patent protection appear to be more expensive in Germany. That count may be overly favorable to Trump RX because generics typically are sold with undisclosed discounts in Germany. If those discounts are big enough, they might yield prices that are lower than those on Trump RX. Abrilado, which is similar to Humira, a treatment for autoimmune conditions, is one example in which Trump RX appeared to offer a much better deal. The Trump RX price for Abrilada injection pen is $500 less than the listed German price before discounts. Pfizer, the drug's manufacturer, declined to comment on the German price, but praised Trump RX generally. For obesity drugs, Japanese shoppers win. When the White House talks about the lowest prices in the world, it's really talking about those in 8 wealthy countries. White House officials said they had negotiated the Trump RX prices by comparing them with those in Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Britain, Switzerland, and Denmark. So we visited pharmacies in these countries to check the out-of-pocket prices for obesity medications. U.S. prices for these drugs have plummeted in recent months, thanks in part to Mr. Trump's deals with the manufacturers. As recently as the summer of 2024, many Americans were paying about $1,000 a month for Zepbound. Now they can pay less than half that. But that doesn't make them the world's cheapest. Prices vary depending on dose and pharmacy, but Trump RX prices were consistently among the most expensive. Japan's were consistently the cheapest. Higher prices for Zepbound on Trump RX. How much patients pay out of pocket at a pharmacy without using insurance for a 4-week supply of medium-dose 5 milligrams of Zepbound. Eli Lilly's injection for weight loss. Japan, $155. Canada, $256. Britain, $279. Switzerland, $284. France, $288. Germany, $320. Denmark, $333. Trump RX, $399. Italy, $399. Misty Fuller, a spokeswoman for Eli Lilly, which makes Zepbound, said comparing out-of-pocket prices across countries created a skewed portrayal. She said that prices must be adjusted for each country's economy. A dollar goes further in some countries than others, she said. A medicine isn't necessarily cheaper abroad if wages and living costs are lower there. Liz Skirvova, a spokeswoman for Novo Nordisk, which makes Wegovy, said that the comparing of U.S. drug prices to those in other countries ignores vast differences in healthcare systems. Amit Sarpatari, a Harvard Medical School researcher who studies pharmaceutical policy and reviewed our findings, said they showed the need for greater pricing transparency. The claim that the Trump administration is making that Americans are getting the best deal is clearly false. Dr. Sarpatawari said it is very easy to mislead the public about drug costs. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. U.S. suspends oil shipping rules to ease gas price pressures. The Jones Act dictates that only ships made in the United States can transport cargo between U.S. ports. Such vessels, which must also be crewed by Americans, charge customers more than foreign ships. The Trump administration said on Wednesday that it would temporarily relax a maritime law that restricts the way oil is shipped within the United States as it seeks to stem the rise in fuel prices resulting from the war in the Middle East. Relaxing the law known as the Jones Act could reduce the cost of transporting fuel and agricultural products by ship between American ports, but analysts and some shipping executives expect the move to have only a marginal impact on gasoline prices. President Trump is waiving the Jones Act requirements for 60 days to mitigate the short-term disruptions to the oil market as the U.S. military continues meeting the objectives of Operation Epic Fury, Caroline Leavitt, a White House spokesperson, said on X. Ms. Leavitt added the waiver would allow vital resources like oil, natural gas, fertilizer, and coal to flow freely to U.S. ports. The Jones Act dictates that only ships made in the United States can pick up cargo at American ports and transport it to another U.S. port. Such vessels, which must also be crewed by Americans, cost customers more than foreign ships. The restriction has been waived before, for instance, after Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico in 2017 and in 2021 when an energy pipeline was shut down by a cyber attack. The introduction of cheaper foreign vessels is expected to shave only pennies off the cost of gasoline, which has jumped 29% to an average of $3.84 per gallon, from $2.98 on February 28th when the United States and Israel started their attacks on Iran, according to AAA. American tankers cost about $50,000 a day more to hire than foreign vessels, said James Lightbourne, the founder of Cavalier Shipping, a shipping financing advisory firm. Using non-American ships would cut transportation costs by about 5 cents a gallon. The largest component of gasoline prices is the cost of oil, which has surged around 40% since the start of the war, as Iran responded by effectively shutting down oil exports from the Persian Gulf. The Jones Act, passed in 1920 to ensure that the United States had sufficient shipping capacity, does not apply to vessels transporting goods from foreign countries. Shipbuilding executives and union leaders say the United States needs the law to protect its maritime industries, but the law's critics say it piles costs on businesses and consumers, particularly those in Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico, whose economies rely far more on American shipping and has led to a reduction in the share of goods transported by water. The Trump administration's decision to grant Jones Act waivers amidst war and rising energy costs exposes both the law's economic burden and the flimsiness of its national security rationale, said Colin Grabow, an associate director at the Cato Institute, a research organization that favors less government regulation of business. Christopher Natal, Associate Dean for Climate and Sustainability at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, said academic research had found that the Jones Act added about 1.5 cents to the cost of gasoline. It's not a huge number, but adds up given how much gasoline we consume, he said. In another move aimed at preventing oil price rises, the United States said last week that it was going to release 172 million barrels of oil from its strategic reserves over 4 months beginning next week. Crude oil prices rose despite the decision. The cost of the AI boom, a trade deficit the president detests. A recent surge of AI-related imports has become an impediment to the smaller trade deficit President Trump wants. President Trump has long viewed the U.S. trade deficit, the gap between what the country exports and imports, as a negative barometer of the economy, but these days the trade deficit is being driven in part by something essential to the success of Mr. Trump's presidency. The rise of artificial intelligence has become a force propelling the economy and the stock market, but it is also fueling the U.S. trade deficit, as tech companies import expensive foreign computers and chips to fill their new data centers. U.S. imports of computers, computer accessories, and semiconductors topped more than $450 billion over the past year, shooting up more than 60% from when Mr. Trump was inaugurated through this January, according to the U.S. trade data. Computers and electronics have become a sizable chunk of overall U.S. good imports, which reached $3.4 trillion last year. The 2025 trade deficit in goods grew to a record $1.2 trillion. In particular, the U.S. trade deficit with Taiwan, the source of the most advanced AI semiconductors, roughly doubled last year to $146 billion. Brad Setzer, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, who has analyzed the trade data, said the construction of AI data centers across the country was very import intensive, with South Korea, Taiwan, and China all reporting strong export growth in AI-related products. Unless there is a shock that reduces planned investment, it is hard to see how this doesn't result in a larger U.S. trade deficit in 2026, he said. Mr. Trump sees the trade deficit as a sign of economic weakness, and he is trying to bring it down by imposing tariffs on foreign goods. It is a strategy many economists have questioned. Some economists say that the trade deficit is driven largely by other economic forces like government spending or the value of the dollar. Others say that the tariffs may reduce demand for foreign goods, but that Mr. Trump has carved out significant swaths of imports that avoid high tariffs like pharmaceuticals and electronics. Unlike cars, steel, and other goods, electronics were intentionally spared by Mr. Trump. Last April, the administration issued an exemption from tariffs for smartphones, computers, semiconductors, and other electronics. It was a significant break for the tech companies like Apple, NVIDIA, and Dell that have lobbied the president against broad tariffs. The administration argued that other tariffs would soon hit the sector under a national security-related trade investigation, but those tariffs never arrived. The tariff exemption has increased demand for imports of computers, semiconductors, and other equipment. So has rapid data center construction around the United States. According to the property firm JLL, more than 35 gigawatts of data center capacity is under construction in North America, equivalent to the annual electricity consumption of Britain or Italy. The AI boom has helped prop up an otherwise lackluster U.S. economy. It is also powering growth in the stock market, which Mr. Trump has long seen as a metric of his administration's success. Over the past 3 years, America's largest tech stocks, a group known as the Magnificent Seven, have been responsible for more than half of the 88% gain in the S&P 500. Like the Biden administration before, the Trump administration has tried to encourage the construction of more U.S. factories to make AI chips and computers. The goal is seen as particularly crucial given the industry's dependence on Taiwan, which could someday be under threat from Chinese blockade or invasion. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, the island's premier chip maker, has promised to expand its operations in the United States as part of a U.S.-Taiwan trade deal. But construction of these plants is expected to take years and will still leave the United States dependent on foreign technology suppliers. Howard Lutnick, the Secretary of Commerce, has called for moving 40% of Taiwan's capacity for advanced chip production to the United States within the next 3 years. Taiwanese officials have called the goal impossible. At a news conference on Tuesday, Jensen Huang, the chief executive of NVIDIA, the world's biggest manufacturer of AI chips, said that bringing 40% of Taiwanese chip production to the United States would be very challenging in the near term, in part because demand for AI chips continues to grow so rapidly. The man who would go anywhere. Is there anyone John Lithgow can't or won't play? One of the privileges of being very famous and extremely genial actor is that you might find yourself, as John Lithgow did, at 9:30 on a recent Wednesday morning being welcomed to the Metropolitan Museum of Art on the one day a week it is closed to visitors. Susan Allison Stein, the Met's curator of the 19th century European painting, was walking him privately through the small but astonishing Helene Scheverbeck exhibition, which includes a series of self-portraits made over the course of 60 years that could rip your heart out with their unsparing depictions of stoicism, rage, delight, and decrepitude. Lithgow, who has lately dwindled from 6'4" to 6'3", but maintains a big man's big personality, bubbled with interest as he loped from canvas to canvas. A collector of art and also of curators, he occasionally asked Stein, who has led him on many such tours, about the painter's biography and method and world. I wondered if he was making mental notes on how character arises from circumstance to produce, as he has produced so many extremes. A feeling, but later he told me that while certainly noticing Schefferbeck's combination of great technique and deeply felt emotion, he was mostly thinking wistfully about the art he might have made if he had chosen that life and had been good enough. He's undoubtedly good, as a quick guided tour of his phone's photo gallery demonstrated. For years he has drawn or painted his co-stars and castmates, presenting their portraits as parting gifts. But artist is just another of the roles he has donned and discarded since first tottering onto the stage at age 2. Now 80, having performed on Broadway and television since 1973 and on film starting a few years later, he finds himself approaching what he describes as the end of his career by reaching as far afield as possible, which is saying something for a man who has played, to skim a list stretching over 200 roles, King Lear, Lord Farquaad, Dr. Lozado, the Trinity Killer, Winston Churchill twice, Roberta Muldoon, Bill Clinton, J.J. Hunsaker, a sex-bamboozled diplomat, a dance-banning reverend, a corporate cardinal, and the alien Dick Solomon. The last role, which he performed for 6 seasons starting in 1996 on the sitcom Third Rock from the Sun, may be the one he's still most famous for 30 years later. As he left the Met, a guard shyly stopped him to say how much she loved him on the show. He loved the show too, he told me, for offering the chance to create the kind of outrageous character he can hardly imagine himself playing, but that other people can't imagine being played by anybody else. Yet when you've acted your way to the end of every available limb, where do you go next? Especially when the world in which you learned to love performing, a world that valorized actors who could play anyone and everyone, has changed so radically. Many of the roles Lithgow most treasures are exactly the ones some people would now say that he, a pretty ordinary cisgender straight guy, should never be cast in. His sensitive Oscar-nominated portrayal of Muldoon, the transgender former football player, in The World According to Garp, would surely go to a trans actor today, and though he remains proud to have had the chance to turn his inhabitation of her into drama that deeply moves people and broadens their sensibilities, he accepts that. Still, he keeps pushing himself toward contradiction, difference, and even reputational danger as his choices invite criticism. In the Australian film Jimpa, availability digitally next week, he plays the gay grandfather of a trans grandchild. Yet is Dumbledore also gay? In the upcoming television version of the Harry Potter books, he has associated himself, albeit indirectly, with the author J.K. Rowling, whose social media comments over the years have been seen by many as transphobic. The play Giant, now in previews on Broadway, ties the Lithgowian knot even tighter. He stars in it as Roald Dahl, another hugely successful and divisive children's book author, this one hair-raisingly anti-Semitic. Why, with nothing left to prove, does he make such a beeline for such potentially divisive gigs? I am fascinated by every variety of human experience and want to understand it, he said. I'm in the empathy business. The 2-year-old Lithgow would have been too young to notice, but his stage debut in 1947 established the pattern in drama. His 2011 memoir he writes that the play he appeared in was a vaguely Japanese adaptation of The Emperor's New Clothes, for which someone drew dark diagonal eyebrows on his face in an attempt, then common in the theater but now understood as racist, to suggest that he was Asian. 10 years later, when his scout camp performance as a damsel in distress was met with ear-splitting laughter, my fate was probably sealed. He adds, no accident that his book's subtitle is An Actor's Education. He learned from such experiences to be the kind of performer who found his power playing anyone but himself. The idea of versatility as a virtue was in the air of his upbringing, much of which took place on stage. His was a theatrical family in both senses. His father established and ran a series of classical repertory companies whose precipitous closures led to Joad-like relocations. At one point, like an army brat, but with Shakespeare and Ibsen on his resume, Lithgow attended 3 schools in 2 states in 1 year. That's how he became what he calls a pleaser, someone who, to this day, memorizes immediately everyone's names on every new job, including the many children on the Harry Potter shoot. Noting that Francesca Gardner, the series showrunner, called him a great human, Sophie Hyde, the director of Jimba, said, "Charm and lovability ooze out of him." Nicholas Heitner, the director of Giant, offered this itemization: phenomenal warmth, sympathy, enthusiasm, openness. "Little do they know," Lithgow said. He is very hard on himself. Drama sometimes reads like a public self-flogging, unlike his father, whom he resembles in superficial ways, tall, plummy voice, twinkly, encyclopedic. He says he possesses the son of a bitch chromosome you need to survive in the theater. That's not the same as ruthlessness, though. When retelling a story about his unkindness at age 13 to an outcast girl who tried to befriend him, he started to cry. "Even now it pains me," he said. "That's just too old to be so vile." Well, maybe not yet. Too old, in his early 20s, to evade the Vietnam draft. He played the role of John Lithgow for his examiners, painting himself as an unrecruitable psychological basket case. When asked if he was gay, which would bar him from serving, he said he often thought about his college roommate. The performance, he writes, was a triumph, though it left him feeling deeply ashamed. So did almost the entirety of his busy 1970s, when he says he slept with actresses in 8 of the 20 plays he performed in, culminating in an affair with Liv Ullmann that broke up his first marriage. His second to Mary Yeager, a now retired professor of economic and business history, has lasted ever since. Still, the misbehavior of his youth eventually taught him 2 important lessons. Good people are people capable of bad things, he told me, and more problematically, bad people are capable of good. Which of those lessons is dominant in Giant is the kind of conundrum Lithgow loves to explore. The play by Mark Rosenblatt drops the audience into a fictional 1983 lunch meeting in which Dahl, the beloved author of children's classics, including Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Matilda, and the BFG, faces down representatives of his London and New York publishers. The true part is that Dahl has just reviewed a book about the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, which sought to halt years of rocket attacks by the Palestine Liberation Organization and resulted in the deaths of thousands of Lebanese civilians. The line between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, let alone mere disapproval of the Israeli government's actions, is perennially blurry and at this moment electrified. But Dahl's review stepped definitively, almost gleefully, over it. When his representatives beg him to issue a retraction, not least because his book The Witches is imminently to be published, he instead doubles down on his hatred of Jews. The play incorporates verbatim statements like this one from a 1990 interview with the New Statesman. Quote, "Even a stinkier like Hitler doesn't just pick on them for no reason." End quote. Does it not frighten him, I asked Lithgow as we sat in the cheerful living room of his Upper West Side apartment, to utter such hateful things on stage? Frighten me? No, it excites me. Red meat to a tiger. That's the perversity of us actors. You wait forever for a role like this, full of sadism and monstrosity and hideousness. It's the most hyper-extended I've ever seen or been in any performance, he said, a wild statement from a man who in the 2024 horror film The Rule of Jenny Penn played a snaggletooth psychopath victimizing residents of a nursing home. What will make his doll even more hideous to some and more thrilling to others, or both at once, is that Lithgow hyperextends in 2 directions. He certainly goes full tilt on the monstrosity, that merely uttering but bellowing Dahl's worst slurs are impishly giggling about them. Yet also, Lithgow said, I look like a Geiger counter for those moments when he could break your heart, including one in which a toy box prompts a sudden memory of his firstborn, who died at 7 of measles encephalitis. Lithgow further complicates the character just by being Lithgow. His genius for instantly putting an audience at ease, as Hittner, the director, described it, allows him to use his charm and wit and mischief to make the violence of Dahl's prejudice and cruelty all that more powerful. Turning moral disasters into acting triumphs, Lithgow won the 2025 Olivier Award for the role in London, is at least as old as Shakespeare. The aims of drama are not the same as those of justice or civility. When I asked Heitner whether Lithgow's performance might force people to accept that a monster could write a masterpiece and that the 2 things are unrelated, he simply said, "Good." He meant that people in art and even countries, being complex, should be dealt with complexly. Theater should model, not avoid, that approach. It's in that light that Lithgow sees his appearance in the Potter series, which HBO plans to run for 7 seasons over the course of a decade starting in 2027. He has never met Rowling, nor does he agree with her views on transgender issues, and the story itself is clearly on the side of the angels against intolerance and bigotry, he said. Moreover, he feels that his performance in Garp and Jimba, and as half of an older gay couple in the 2014 film Love is Strange, should be seen as expressions of his interest in queer culture, not as heedless appropriations of it. He assumed his loyalties were clear. Certainly he jumped headfirst, and at one point fully naked except for a leather harness, into Jimbo, which Hyde, the director, said a number of gay actors had turned down. Though his character is resistant to the newfangled terminology of his trans grandchild, he calls the teenager his grand thing. Their mutual love is obvious. The same applied to Lithgow's interactions with the mostly queer cast and crew. In an interview with Out Magazine, awed Mason Hyde, who plays the grandchild and, like the character, is trans, called him such a beautiful human to make work with. But Mason Hyde found Lithgow's decision to join the Potter series disconcerting, telling Out there's an element of this that feels vaguely hurtful. The social media reaction has been far less gentle, with some posts expressing outrage and encouraging boycotts. Stung, Lithgow considered quitting the series but decided not to, and accepts without rancor that in every interview I will ever do for the rest of my life, this will come up. Whether actors inherit the moral onus of authors is now a vexed question. Sophie Hyde, the Jimba director, as well as Mason Hyde's mother, told me that despite her feelings about Rowling, she appreciates that Lithgow is an adult and has a right to make an artistic choice. John's work comes from a place of deep empathy and humanity, and that bigger political conversation is not one he's engaging in. As for the blowback, she added, sometimes you have to think about who you are working with and for, not who you are working against. Surely there's no question where Lithgow stands politically. He's written 3 books of light verse, excoriating Donald J. Trump, the second Trump dedumped that he wanted a crown, published in 2020, includes couplets like this one. He wanted a robe made of ermine and velvet. The Constitution, he wanted to shelve it. Such polemics he leaves on the page. The stage and the screen are not for certainties, but rather, he says, for the little nooks and crannies between them, and also for redemption. When I asked if even Dahl is worthy of that, Lithgow, though finally as unsparing as those Schefferbeck self-portraits, used his best oracular tones to answer with what sounded like awe and hope. Yes, everybody is. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Plus-size flyers once loved Southwest, now they say it's fat shaming. Since the airline changed its policy on larger passengers this year, travelers say agents have publicly scrutinized their bodies and made them buy extra seats. Plus-size passengers once raved about Southwest. Now they say agents are grilling them about body size in front of other travelers, forcing them to buy extra seats they never needed before, or even denying them boarding. Travelers have flooded social media in recent days to express their frustration with Southwest, which in January ended a policy that allowed plus-size passengers either to buy a second seat and later get a refund for it, or to be offered a free extra seat at the gate. Now they say employees of what used to be the most accommodating airline are fat-shaming. On February 6th, Erica DeBoyer, a frequent Southwest traveler, was headed from Omaha to Las Vegas with her best friend. At the gate, an agent asked whether she would need a second seat, suggesting that it was for the safety and comfort of other passengers. Ms. DeBoyer said in a TikTok video. The agent would not take no for an answer, and Mrs. DeBoyer had to pay $176 for an extra seat. It ruined our trip, she said in the video. If I had gotten in the seat and someone had complained, and I am encroaching in the space, I get that. The problem is, what is your process? Southwest, you can't just look at someone and determine that they can't fit in the seat. Under the new policy, the airline requires passengers who encroach on a neighbor to buy a second seat in advance. They will get a refund only if the flight is not full. Passengers who purchase a second seat at the airport will pay the fare available on the day of travel, even if it's more than the cost of their initial ticket. The armrest is considered to be the definitive boundary between seats, the airline says on its website. In addition, Southwest may determine in its sole discretion that an additional seat is necessary for safety purposes. Tigris Osborne, the executive director of the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance and Advocacy Group, said the new policy was put into place with little notice to travelers who trusted the airline and selected it for its welcoming reputation. People who've used the policy for years are showing up at the airport not knowing the policy has changed, Ms. Osborne said, adding that the airline was also being much more aggressive at identifying people as candidates for extra seats. This year's change to Southwest plus-size policy accompanied other shifts that made the carrier unique. It also replaced open seating with assigned seating and introduced a new boarding system and premium seat options. An airline spokesperson said in a statement that Southwest's goal is always to provide a comfortable experience for everyone on board, but that assigned seating meant adjacent seats might be occupied. The airline has reached out directly to affected customers to ensure we address any concerns with the appropriate discretion. Southwest's new policy more closely resembles those of most other major U.S. airlines, which do not guarantee a refund for buying an extra seat. In addition, travelers sometimes have difficulty securing an adjacent second seat and have to call airline customer service. Since Southwest's shift, flying has become more inconvenient and more costly for plus-size travelers, Ms. Osborne said. Ms. DeBoyer and other travelers said they felt a lack of sensitivity and consistency with enforcement differing by agent and flight. They don't stop tall people, broad-shouldered people, man-spreading, Mrs. DeBoyer said, noting that she wasn't made to buy an additional seat on her return flight. Ms. DeBoyer added in the video that on her initial flight, she was supposed to sit next to her best friend, who wouldn't have cared if she encroached. These experiences have also made larger travelers more anxious about what they'll face at airports. Kirsten Catrone, a 24-year-old from Houston, said she was denied boarding on a full Southwest flight at LaGuardia Airport last November because of her size. Two gate agents asked whether she could fit in one seat, rejected her affirmative answer, and said she had to rebook on a later flight because this one did not have two adjacent seats available. The incident and the embarrassment she felt have stuck with her. I travel very frequently, and I've turned down a lot of trips with friends because of it, Ms. Catrone said on a phone interview, but I'm hoping to get back out there for my birthday in May. As for Southwest, she said, in the event that every other airline was closed forever, I'd still never fly with them again. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the March 18th issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been Claudia, and I thank you for listening.